Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt, and welcome to Lit Fic. This is a really special one this time. Um, I want to first say that all books that you buy should be from independent bookstores, and to make it easy for you, we've put up bookshop.org link. And for our guest today, I've put up an exact link so you can order it. If you have questions for our guests, and I bet you will, please just put them in the chat and I'll give them to her. So before I introduced her, I want to show you the cover. A gorgeous excitement. Isn't that great? Central Park, this swirling kind of drug infusement. And even the title just sort of calls you in. Gorgeous Excitement by Cynthia Weiner. And I'm just like so thrilled to have her here, because as soon as I saw this book and the cover and heard about it, I thought, okay, this is somebody I have to talk to. And as soon as I read the book, I thought I have to have her on. The book is just genius. So Cynthia's short stories have been published in Plowshares, The Sun, Epiphany, and her story Boyfriends was awarded a Pushcart Prize. She's also the assistant director of the Writers Studio in New York City. And I'm pleased to say that Jenna Blum, our co-founder, is also here, and she said she's so excited for this conversation. So that's really great. Hi, Jenna. The story is inspired by something that I remember so vividly, having been in New York City at the time. Robert Chambers' murder of Jennifer Levin in Central Park in 1986. It was called the Preppy Murder. It deeply impacted everyone for a whole variety of reasons. First of all, it was Upper East Side, privileged kids, white kids, the bar scene, how it was a time, the 80s in New York City were really a whole time of experimentation and sex and this and that, and also victimization. This was also a murder that deeply impacted Cynthia's life, because she grew up in that Upper East Side and she casually knew Chambers. But it's also this brilliant novel about a young woman coming to terms with 1980s New York City class, anti-Semitism, mental illness, and what it means to be safe. So before we talk to Cynthia, let's read some of the high praise first. Kirkus gave it a starred review, and as all of you know, Kirkus is notoriously cranky, and they never give stars. They said this is carefully paced and beautifully written. This edgy coming-of-age novel succeeds on all counts. Publishers Weekly called it lush and thrilling. Town and Country called it powerful and profound, and included it on their 36 must-read books of winter, 2025 books. And I sort of want to add my praise. I think this book doesn't just show you a time and a place. It pushes you into that time and a place, so you're living it. And that's a kind of alchemy that few authors are able to create. And Cynthia, you did that. So Cynthia, welcome so much for coming here. Here's your gorgeous cover. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. My gosh, I'm so glad that this was recorded and I can hear that again. That was so lovely. Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
You are so welcome. So there's so much to talk about here. And a reminder to people out there, hi, Renee Herskovitz is here, and so is Robin Stull. Any questions you have, just pop them in the chat, and I promise you I'll get to them. So I want to know, obviously you lived through this as I did, as many of us did, but what was the why now moment that made you write this particular novel? Because New York City is very different now.
Well, I had tried to write the novel. I tried to write it as a story for many years. And I always remembered the story. I always wanted to write about it. But I also tried, and I wrote other things. I also have 4 nieces, and I don't have children, but these 4 nieces, and watching them grow up and get older, and now they're all teenagers, watching them try to navigate the world and boys and the social goings on. And that was a big influence on me to realize things aren't that different. And then in addition to that, once a certain person was elected president, and yes, the way, that he speaks about women and about sex and just the vulgarity of it and the cruelty of it, also spurred me on a lot too. So those were some of the main reasons.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about that, about how we are always drawn, at least young girls, for
Okay.
some reason, are always drawn to boys and guys who are intensely bad. Nina in the book is drawn to Gardner Pierce, who's like the Robert Chambers character, handsome. He seems privileged. He's going to a preppy school. And recently, to show you how this progresses through time, there was this great indie movie, which I bet you saw, which was based on the true story of this handsome young serial killer who was a contestant on the dating game. And he was actually chosen. I forget the name of the show, but he was chosen. But this young woman actually began to feel that something was off, and she saved herself, and he was arrested soon afterwards. I also wanted to ask, because you were in this scene, because when I was running around in the 80s, I felt invincible. I never saw danger. I hitchhiked. I got into cars with Hell's Angels, and I never thought anything bad would happen to me. And I was very lucky that it didn't. So when you were in that scene and you vaguely knew Robert Chambers, did you ever get that feeling from him? Or were you attracted to him because there was something edgy and bad about him? And how did you come to realize later on that danger actually is not exciting, especially for young women? I'm sorry, that's like a 6-part question.
No, that's okay. I was attracted to boys who seemed to not care what anybody thought, because that was something I was desperate for. And bad boys don't care what anybody thinks. They seem not to. They seem free in a way that I wanted to be free, and I know Nina would like to be free. That uninhibited and not scared all the time. So that was one thing. In real life, I knew Robert Chambers. He was friends with friends of mine. Everybody was sort of messed up at the time. Everybody did drugs. Everybody drank too much, and he just seemed like one of these other people. I always felt safe because it seemed to me you could always get in a taxi. You had doormen. Everything seemed safe. Of course it wasn't, but there was one time when he was at my parents' apartment, which I don't think ever knew about, and we were smoking out the window, and the joint we were smoking was tea, so I threw it out the window. I couldn't hold it anymore, and he grabbed my arm and started yelling at me, "Why did you do that? Why did you?" Really angry. So in that moment, I felt like, oh. But besides that, he honestly seemed like somebody else. He seemed like a really good looking guy who all the girls liked and all the guys looked up to, and that's what he seemed to be. So was part of the shock was when that happened, was no one would have ever thought something like that.
No, nobody ever could. So the bar that Nina and her friends go to was Dorian's Red Hand. And I remember it was, I was a downtown girl, so there's no way I would have gone uptown. But the Upper East Side of the 80s was so different from what it is now. What did it feel like for you to remember? Did you talk with other people you had grown up with? And was it sort of unsettling to look back at your younger self and now you're in a very different place, as is the city? What did that all feel like?
Looking back on myself, which I put a lot of myself into Nina, and seeing how insecure I was and how desperate to be paid attention and to be thought appealing and pretty was sad. I remember that.
Right.
It's, part of me sometimes, that insecurity, although certainly less so. And remembering what it's like to grow up with a troubled mother, as she does, and that was very close to my experience. That was something that was very difficult to look back on. I have to say about the Upper East Side, the one thing I'll say is I went to Dorian.
You did?
It was.
Oh, it's still there? It's still. Oh my God! I didn't realize it was.
It is still packed with preppy kids. I went I don't know if they're still called preppy. The night before Thanksgiving, which was always a big night there when everybody got home from boarding school and everyone came home from college, it was crammed with a bunch of young, good-looking people. So it's still there and still thriving. So
Wow.
they're still there, and you were much cooler. I was back. I was on the.
I was a mess. We were all a mess back then. I mean, I probably was doing the same drugs as you, so and the same too much drinking or whatever else. The interesting, really, truly interesting thing for me that the book delves into, and also that happened at that time, was victim shaming. I remember in the Jennifer Levin case, all of a sudden it turned from shock to who was Jennifer Levin? She was the one who wanted rough sex. She could have stopped it, and she didn't. She was called a whore. I think they grabbed her diary and read parts of it. And, of course, there was also the anti-Semitism, Jewish girls are easy, and all this kind of stuff. And it got really, really frightening. I mean, we talked about this a little before we got on the air, where I was telling you, I remember the Newsweek cover had a picture of Jennifer on it, just sort of looking like this. And I remember my boyfriend said, "Oh, she could have been you." And I was really sort of offended, because at that time, people were saying she asked for it. It was that kind of mentality, which actually still goes on today. So can you talk about like the victim shaming back then, and how it's still going on today, and how it felt to write all this stuff? And
well, Robert Chambers, so in the real case, he said it was an accident. That was, he said she was hurting him. She was hitting his like genitals with a stick and squeezing too hard. So he had to get her off of it because she was hurting him. And so the press ran with that. Much of the book is fiction, but I used all the real headlines, such as, I changed the girl's name, but rough sex gone wild, and Penny courted danger. That was
courted danger, and we did.
The sex diary, which was really her address book, her date book. It was not even a diary. All of that was made up, and the lawyer made it up, and Robert Chambers made it up. So a lot of that came from that. But in addition, I remember going to dinner with a guy, or drinks with a guy, like a week later, and he said Jennifer Levin was a slut. She was a drunk, and none of which is true. But even if it were true, so what? It doesn't mean anything.
So what? It doesn't mean that she can be, because I remember that it just kept getting worse and worse until there was a video released of Robert Chambers was palling around with some young girls, and they were all drooling over him, and he took a doll and he twisted its head off, and he was laughing, and it was just like incredible. I also wanted to talk about, Renee mentions that many men still seem to think it's always the woman's fault. Very sad. And I think, Renee, that's true. And I think that's partly the reason for what's going on in our government, where a lot of people feel that women should be back in the home, that they should be like household objects, and, that it's their fault. Many cultures feel that it's women's fault for enticing men just by existing, which certainly is not true. Nobody says, well, if the men are the ones doing the attacking and the raping, why aren't they being, kept at home away from people? But anyway, I want to talk about drugs, because there's a lot of drugs in the book. And what's so interesting, that it's not just the recreational drugs, the opium that was around. Crack was starting to be really big in the 80s in my neighborhood, but there's also prescription drugs, like the one that Nina's mom, who has mental health issues, took, and which changed her in a better way. Not a way of excitement, the way people, taking Coke would feel, but just being pleased to feel better. Can you talk about, did you always know you were going to do the two juxtapositions of the two kinds of drugs, and why you added in the second kind?
Well, once I realized that the story was about a mother who's very, very depressed and becomes manic, I sort of understood the arc of the story, that it was about a sort of exhilaration that starts off feeling wonderful and feeling great, and everybody feels great, and Nina feels great, her mother feels great, and everyone doing cocaine feels great, and then it gets darker and darker as people go farther with it. Once I sort of came on that, the mother takes a medication that sort of unfortunately turns her manic. So first it's great, and she's feeling better, and Nina thinks she's so happy that her mother, who's been depressed her whole life, basically is finally feeling better. And then she kind of ignores all the red flags of what's incipient mania, a bipolar episode, because she's just so glad her mother seems to be doing better, so
Yeah, I
no,
liked all that. I liked all that. And I also really appreciated the mental illness component of the book because, you could say that everybody was sort of suffering from mental illnesses at that time. It was just so crazy. I wanted to ask about I've read somewhere where somebody said this was a delicious response to Jay McInerney's book, Bright Lights, Big City, which was also about drugs and being privileged and white and the Upper East Side. I remember that book, which was annoyingly written in the second person, by the way, which kept us apart. And I also, I vaguely knew him. And I remember the model that you described in the book who was slashed, and we talked about that. Did his book influence you at all? And I didn't get the feeling that you felt this was a response to his book. I felt that your book was wholly original. But did you intend that, or were you aware of it?
I remember his book very well. I remembered that it was about cocaine. I remember a lot of images from it. And it's funny, I read his book again, and the very beginning of the book, it's very word oriented. The guy is at a club and he's saying, he's trying to remember, he's trying to come up with a list of words that begin with the letter K or something like that. And
That's right.
yeah. So the one similarity is in my book, Nina's very interested in words. She's very interested in reading. And so I thought, well, that's kind of similar, but really she goes to a nightclub and that, but she's more of an outsider. I think she's more of a innocent.
Right. She definitely is an outsider, which is why we root for her, because she so much wants to be a part of this world. And through the novel, she's able to discover other worlds and herself. I want to talk more about like words and books and Nina. There's this great line at the end of the book where Nina's talking to her mother about the ways we want to be known. And to me, that's like the crux of how you live your life. You want to be known. You want to know other people. And so I wanted to ask, where do you see Nina 10 years down the line from the end of the book? Is she okay?
I do think so. The way I ended the book, which I don't want to give away.
No, don't give away.
There was a moment where she feels seen. She feels known. And I won't say with who, I won't say more, but or anything, but it's toward the end of the book. And as you said, I think that's not something I felt that much in my childhood. I was talking with a friend of mine today about our mothers from the 80s, and everyone's parents were gone, and everybody was
crazy.
out of
Yeah.
Everyone was social, or everyone was away, or they were on prescription drugs or drinking too much. I feel like children weren't valued. Well, I'll speak for myself in the way that maybe they are today,
Right.
and attention to, and interested in, so I think that's something Nina's been searching for. And I hope my agent, when she read the book, said something so sweet. The first, she said, one day she'll make a really good mother. And I was like,
oh, that's really nice.
That. Yeah. So.
I wanted to ask you also about female friendship. Nina has a really close friend with Stephanie, and their arc is a story of its own, especially, when you're in your 20s, friendship, especially with female, is so important. I was inseparable from my best friends. Do you see it as a survival tool for those times? And how do you see it in terms of today?
Well, I see it in terms of the book. I was thinking about girls who've gone to school together for, 12 years, 18 years, and they're all kind of a little tired of each other by the time they're seniors in high school. And, they know each other's worst faults, and they know each other's worst sides, and they've been in fights for years. And Nina discovers this new friend she meets her in Central Park, and another outsider. So I wanted that she has this new friend who doesn't know her and just thinks she's terrific. And I feel like anyone at any time who meets a friend like that, as you said, it's like you fall in love. And I know that my nieces who are 18 and 20 have new friends like that. They still have their old friends from high school, but they've both recently started college. And one's been there for a couple of years, but they, they have these new friends who see them in a new, fresh way. And I think that's such a lovely thing for any girl to have. And I really wanted Nina to get to have that. That felt really important to me. Yeah.
There's something really interesting about, our minds travel back to intense times. In your case, it was a time of great possibility and danger, and yet it was also an innocence about it. And I was wondering, why do you think our minds travel back to those intense times? Do you think in this case it's that yearning to be that innocent, even though there's danger and drugs and this and that? It still seems like we were also open to experience back then, no matter the cost. Did you feel that way?
Oh, yes. I read somewhere that it's like the movies that you see when you're 13 and 14 and 15 and 16 are the ones that always stay with you. It's like you're that open-heartedness and open-mindedness. Now, if someone invites me somewhere, half the time I just say, I stay at home. I'm happy to be at home. But then I loved going out. I loved meeting new people. I loved hearing new music and seeing new movies and reading new books and staying in bookstores all day. I just was and I do miss that a lot. I wish I were more like
It's very different now. Yeah, it's very different now. It's sort of like, the clubs are very different. I was always in the clubs and in the bars and all the places. It's just very, very different. So I want to talk about classism among privileged people and not so privileged people, because that's always a really big thing. I mean, even now, when we were thinking of sending my son to schools, and it was always, do we send him to private school, which first of all will probably break us financially, but also there was such a thing that I had a friend whose son went to Dalton, and he went to school with a very famous filmmaker's son. And the filmmaker's son came over one day when I was there, and he looked around my friend's apartment, which was big, and said, "Where's the rest of it?" And he was, criticizing the toys and saying, "Well, I'm going to Aspen this weekend. Are you coming?" And my friend's son said, "No, I can't." And the kids kept saying, "Well, why not? Why can't you? Why can't you get them?" And we finally decided on public school. First financially, and also because I didn't want my son exposed to that. So I wanted to talk about how classicism changed Nina. And did it change you? Like, how did your experiences compare?
I mean, I would say, at that time, it was classicism, and it was also not growing up in that world. So being Jewish was part of it. I hadn't grown up in that world. My grandparents hadn't grown up in that world. I was thinking today, I had friends who went to Maine and New Hampshire in the summers. My parents would never have thought of that. It just was all of these sort of very preppy things that people did. And when, their cars had been in the family forever, and the sweaters had been in the family forever, and the antiques, we didn't have that. So I think I did feel that insecurity of there's a world that all of these people have been part of before they were born, and I was not. And that I felt very uncomfortable. I felt like an interloper a lot of times. And I think that was honestly part of the Robert Chambers, was that, well, at least at first, people would say he's one of us. I mean, it turned out he wasn't.
Right, he wasn't. That's right.
But he showed, and he went to Browning, and she was the outsider. Meanwhile, it turned out that he didn't really come from a lot of money, and he'd been in a lot of trouble. There's a lot of that too. And I think my guess is he felt a lot of that discomfort. I
think he did.
Yeah, it's that way.
I think he did. What's your writing life like? How do you write in the morning? Do you plan things out? Does it just sort of flow from you effortlessly? How do you write?
I try to write in the mornings. I try to just sit there as long as I can, before work and things like that. I do some reading. I like to read poetry a lot before I work. I just like to not be too involved in a story, but more in language. I don't plan things out, but a wonderful teacher that I had, and a friend named Heather Sellers, she has a great book called Chapter by Chapter. And one of the things she says in it is plan the night before, like a roadmap. what you want to do the next day. I do try to do that in the middle. It was a very helpful thing, like lying in bed, just thinking, okay, who do I want to write about tomorrow? Or what's an image you have? And fall asleep with that. So that was always helpful, but it's just sitting and sitting.
It is. But that is incredibly helpful. I've actually started doing that for this book that I'm writing now, or before I go to sleep, I think, okay, tomorrow I'm going to just do this one part of this character's story. My only problem with that, and I wonder if it's a problem for you, is like sometimes in the morning I don't remember what I thought about, or I remember it and then I have to get up and write it and I can't read my writing. Do you also give yourself like a hint to remember this when you wake up?
No, but that's a really good idea to give myself a hint. I don't. But I will say sometimes I'm working on something I will remember and I'll be like, oh yeah, that's right. Wasn't I going to do such and such today? But the best thing I did, I will say, and I do not work for this company, but Freedom or any of those software applications that turn off the internet, that's probably the best thing I do for myself, because the internet is such a problem for me.
It's a time suck. Yeah. It's a time suck. Can you tell us about the writer's studio and the great work you do there?
Oh, thank you. The Writer's Studio is it's a sort of adult education school in New York City. Now it has branches all over the country, some in different parts of the world, most, all online. And the focus at the Writer's Studio, everybody does exercises every week, trying out a narrator from a different text. Like we make an exercise each week out of either a short story or a novel or a poem, and using the narrator. So whether it's first person or third person or the dreaded second person once in a while. It could be a very wordy narrator or a sad narrator or a lyrical narrator. And the idea is to try out all different voices so that you sort of figure out, you come closer paradoxically to your own voice. And it does seem to work well. So it's a good program.
That's a great idea. What's obsessing you now and why?
I have a new idea for a book. I don't want to say what it is, but it's very violent. I don't know why I am attracted to all of this violence, and I can't stop thinking about it. I just can't wait to sit down and write about it. But I think about it all the time. It's also about a murder. I don't know why, but a boy who murders. But so that's kind of what that and political situation, which I try to.
Oh yes, yes. This is my opportunity to tell anybody who's out there listening that I am Caroline Leavitt with a C, not Caroline Leavitt with a K, and I am not Trump's press secretary. I get a lot of email for her, which I quickly dispatch. Okay, so I want to also know, what do you do for fun?
I have two cats who I really love, who I play with. My boyfriend and I, we like to go out to dinner. We like to watch TV, just the ordinary
stuff.
I like to read.
Yeah. It's funny that the things that you do for fun now are probably very different than the things you did for fun in the 80s. So I have another question about that, which is actually my last question. So anybody out there, if you have another question for Cynthia, please pop it in the chat. Don't be shy, which has to do with the young people of today and their culture. For me, my son is in his late 20s now, but when he was in his early 20s and stuff, I began to really be aware of how different this generation is from our generation. And I was wondering, what thoughts and fears you have for the upcoming young generation. Is it they don't really have the opportunity to, taking a lot of drugs and drinking, even though it sounds terrible, was a lot more innocent back then. Now, if you take a lot of drugs, you don't know what the drug is laced with, and you could die. So what are your thoughts about that?
Oh, it's just terrible. Fentanyl. we used to go, not that pot is a great drug, whatever, but that seemed innocent. Now it's in pot, it's in everything, the fentanyl, and people are just dropping. It's
I know, so scary.
It's just horrifying. Yeah. And the really a lot of drinking. I mean, I know we drank a lot too, but there just seems to be.
It was different though. It was different. The other thing too is that, Nina talks a lot about wanting to be seen, wanting to be known. And back then, people had a lot of long conversations, fueled by alcohol and drugs. And also everybody was sort of sleeping with everybody else. And now it seems, statistics show that people don't do that as much. There's not the hookup culture is very different, and it's not as much, and the conversations aren't as much. And I feel there's a loss in that. Do you?
Yeah. I mean, there were no phones. I mean, nobody, you're right. When you sat down to have a conversation, you had a conversation, and there was no distraction, and there was no taking. We never took pictures. Once in a while, a Polaroid.
Once in a while, very few.
Photographing everything and posting it everywhere, and friends could read it and see that what we did or what we didn't do, or they weren't invited. I mean, all of that. There was a lot more privacy.
Yeah.
I think in ways I feel these younger people are really missing out on. Privacy was very important to me. Not an intimacy.
Intimacy. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you have a comment from Renee. Okay. And question. First, she said, it seems that the younger generation is glued to their cell phones. I find that they're missing out on life. I do too. My main thing is I like to walk, because that's when I daydream and I think about stuff. And you always see, we call them phone zombies, because they're always on their phones. I keep thinking, don't you want to dream? Don't you want to see what's going on? The other question Renee has is, can you show us your cats, please?
Oh my gosh, I'm so sad to say they're not here with me. I'm at my boyfriend's.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
If you go on to, I had on Jane Radcliffe's wonderful Beyond, she's a mutual friend, Beyond Substack. She had a piece from me today about craft, and there's a picture of my cats on there.
Oh, okay. So we all have to go there. I'm going to put that in the comments. Please visit. What's the name of Jane's Substack?
Jane's Substack is called Beyond, which, Renee, if you don't know it, it's a wonderful Substack where she interviews writers and asks the best questions. She's terrific. And she asked me a question about my cats, and she put a picture of them on there.
That's great. That's great. Okay, so I want to show this gorgeous cover again. This is one of my favorite books. I always say that I don't have room. Every floor of ours is covered with books, and I keep the books that I love the most in this, which is my writing office. And I'm keeping this one up here. I mean, Cynthia, it's so good. I haven't really spoke yet a lot about how beautifully it's written, but it really is. It's masterfully done. It's, parts of it are funny. Most of it will break your heart. It's just so incredibly immersive and great. It's one of my favorite books of the year. And remember, bookshop.org, your favorite indie. I've got a link up in the chat, and all you have to do is click on it. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody and say see you next week. But Cynthia, you stay on so I can thank you privately. And thank you all for being here. And really, this book is it's everything. It's absolutely everything. So thank you all, and I'll see you next week. And I'll see you in a second, Cynthia.